Dobbin.
My lady, may I please call Sir Gavin Williamson?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence that I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming on to help us again.
Thank you.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Gavin Alexander Williamson.
Sir Gavin, in your witness statement, you've set out the detail of your political career, but for our purposes, it's right, isn't it, that you were the Secretary of State for Education from July 2019 until September 2021?
Yes, that's correct.
I'm sorry, I ought to have asked you before I embarked on your examination. You ought to have a witness statement in front of you that bears the number INQ 000588024. Do you have that in front of you?
I haven't got my witness statement with me because I thought it was going to be provided.
Yes,
it is on the computer now, yes. Yeah. Sorry, yes.
Can you confirm that the contents
Yes.
of that witness statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
That's correct.
I'm grateful. Sir Gavin, when Sir John Coles gave evidence before the inquiry, and having read your witness statement, he described your evidence in it that your department hadn't done any planning by mid-March 2020 for school closures because the priority was keeping schools open as an extraordinary dereliction of duty. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, I think what was interesting about modules 1 and modules 2 of the inquiry was what government had been going through was, I thought it was a process that there'd been for long-term planning in terms of dealing with the pandemic and putting actions in place all the way through to try and get things right into terms of how we thought a pandemic would be. And that was sort of examined in Module 1. I think in Module 2, I think there were failures. There are failures that were demonstrated. It showed Module 2 where those failures had been in terms of planning and really understanding the enormity of what a pandemic would mean and how that would impact every aspect of government, and government not really grasping the enormity of that. And I think that was reflective in the DFE. There were lots of actions that were being taking place, which we thought were the right actions. But as we look back at it now, we should have had different actions in place in order to be better prepared for it. So I readily accept that there were many mistakes that were made both pre-start of the pandemic and in those early stages of the pandemic, because I don't think the DFE was any different to the number 10 or the Cabinet Office or other departments that were leading the way in terms of dealing with that pandemic.
This isn't a comparative exercise, Sir Gavin.
I appreciate.
I'm just focusing on you for the moment.
Of course.
So you don't accept it was a dereliction of duty on your part. Do you accept it was a dereliction of duty on the part of the government to fail to plan for school closures?
I think we should have done it very differently. I think we should have pre-2020, we should have had a clear plan with a range of scenarios, not just about dealing with the influenza pandemic, of looking at different ways of keeping schools open in different manner. There should have been a whole set of different routes that we could have gone down. And in reality, we had got one route that we thought was the right route, and we didn't demonstrate the agility and we didn't have the range of options that were needed to be ready for the pandemic that we actually faced.
So failures on the part of people before you came into office, is that what you're saying?
No, I would say failures. I'd say failures from those who were in office and those who had previously been in office, because obviously, as the pandemic unfolded during the February and the March period, the scale and the impact that this was having, I don't feel as if everyone totally understood as to how this was going to change everything. I recall being in meetings where this is sort of a cabinet meeting where the question was asked about, face masks and such like, and the idea of wearing a face mask seemed so alien to anything that we would do in this country. And when we were sort of advised that this actually would be a very negative thing to be doing, well, in reality is, as the pandemic progressed, things that we thought we would never have been doing or would never need to do were things that we ended up having to do. And I think the whole government and my department itself should have had a clearer sense and understanding of just how things that we could never believe would have been possible were going to be the things that we were going to have to do. And ideally, you would have had this done in 2013, 2014, 2015, where every action that you take doesn't either feed a narrative or, press speculation, because it's been done in the calm of no pandemic. But in light of the fact that that sort of pathway wasn't there, we should have, right across government, understood the significance much better and bitten the bullet and made those plans in a way that would have helped later on. I would just add, one of the challenges in different departments are structured differently, but Department for Education as a department isn't a department with staffed by hundreds of social workers, hundreds of teachers. It's staffed by policy officials. And so when you're starting to develop anything in terms of a response to something, the most important thing you usually do is actually go out and ask those people who are on the coalface, who are working in the field as a social worker or as a teacher, as to what's their advice as to how this would be done and how this would be sort of constructed. And I think that we discovered that obviously a lot of the internal knowledge to enable things always sat outside of the department.
I'm just going to ask you to stop there, because that's a very long answer to quite a short question, and I'm going to take this in stages. Why was it apparent to people like Sir John Coles or Mr. Barnaby of another school trust that schools would close, and not apparent to you as the Secretary of State for Education?
Well, we were focused, and we were given a clear indication that we were to keep schools open. There was the key thrust of where the government policy was to maintain the opening of schools. We were being asked to develop papers and to develop the work that was required in order to be able to keep children within schools and that was the direction and that was the instruction. Equally, you can't, something like COVID is being directed from the centre in terms of different departments' responses. You don't have quite the freedom just to go and start going out and consulting with lots of people as to what school closures will look like, because
Can I just ask you to pause there? You're suggesting that as the Secretary of State for Education, you didn't have the ability to go out to ask people what school closures would look like. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is when you're dealing with a pandemic, all the key decisions were being taken at the centre, namely within Number 10 Cabinet Office. So to start doing the direct work in terms of school closures invariably would have been quite a significant thing to do without Number 10 and Cabinet Office being in the loop that you were going to actually start doing that consultation, because invariably you're talking to numerous people outside of the government and the civil service, and that news would spread quite rapidly.
I think what Sir John Coles would say to that, Sir Gavin, is that he, like everyone else, was watching the news himself.
Yes.
And watching what was happening in other countries, and therefore it was perfectly apparent to him or to people like him that schools would close. Yeah. Hardly news.
Well, during that period in March, in fact, the week before school closures happened, in my morning meetings, it was one of the questions that we raised where the spectre of school closures could be there. I remember asking officials to sort of seek further clarity as to whether this is where we should be sort of moving towards. The feedback I had got from my officials, I think they'd spoken to someone in the Chief Medical's officer's office. I think it had come through Jonathan Slater, my permanent secretary, that this wasn't a space that the government was going to be looking at going down, because of course it was a question that we're asking. It was there was talk of firewalls, and the question was, is the Easter would the Easter holidays potentially be used as a firewall? Would an extra week have to be taken off or something like that? But we were told that that wasn't the case.
I'm going to ask you to pause there, because we're going to break this down and look much more closely at the information that was available to you. You started off, I think, that answer by saying, or a couple of answers ago, by saying that you couldn't start doing direct work because news would start to escape. But we're not even talking about direct work, are we, Sir Gavin? I mean, we're talking about the absolute basics here of thinking about what school closures would look like, the massive ramifications that would have for almost every school child in the country, and the enormous effort that would have to be made in order to ready schools for that eventuality. It's that failure, isn't it? It's the failure to even contemplate, think about that in February 2020. I mean, that's what is meant by a dereliction of duty, isn't it?
I, as I said, I readily accept that as we look at this, the work that you would have liked to have had in place would have been there, and it wouldn't have been just done in February. It would have been done a long time before that, but it would have been better. It would have been done in February. But we were focused in terms of, the steer that we had, the belief that our understanding was that, and we saw that in the legislation that was being passed in terms of our approach and how we were wanting to approach it. We believed, and it was very much as part of the plan, as that was the right way of dealing with the pandemic.
The other thing that Sir John or the other school leaders had access to, but you did, was the advice of SAGE, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the reasons why this failure is all the more alarming is because it was being advised, wasn't it, from the 4th of February onwards, that school closures were contemplated and were one of the steps that might be taken in order to deal with the pandemic, correct?
That is correct. It was in one of the meetings on the 4th of
Can we have a look at that, please? It's INQ 000 061512. And we can see from the big headline, SAGE 4 minutes, coronavirus COVID-19 response, 4 February 2020. And if we can go, please, to page 6 of this. And if we can look, please, at paragraph 38 first. As evidenced through previous behavioural science studies, regional closing of schools can be expected to have impacts elsewhere in the country, as parents outside those regions would choose to withdraw children from school. And then action, if we go to the action box, please. SPI-M with input from James Rubin to consider the impact of closing schools in different outbreak scenarios and advise SAGE on what triggers would require discussion as to whether schools should close. So from the 4th of February, very clear, isn't it, from SAGE, that this is one of the options on the table being contemplated in order to deal with the pandemic.
Yeah, and indeed, SAGE highlighted many different options and different potential actions. And, we, as I say, with where we ended up, I'm sure the Prime Minister and everyone else would have wished at the time that we'd put a much greater emphasis in terms of putting a plan, a detailed plan in place as to sort of what that looks like. What we're being clearly steered towards was that we should be focused in terms of the efforts of keeping schools open. At the time of that coming out, very much the focus, at the time of that coming out, and even number of weeks later, the focus was very much about not just schools staying open, but also the Prime Minister wanted the economy staying open. And so, yes, do I wish we had done it differently? Yes, I very much do.
I think, Sir Gavin, the inquiry is interested in why none of this, and we're going to go through a number of bits of SAGE advice, prompted anyone to take action. But before I do that, we do know, don't we, that on the 6th of February, the Chief Scientific Advisor to your department did commission reasonable worst-case scenario planning, didn't he?
That's correct.
And were you familiar with that?
I was aware that he was undertaking it, and earlier in the year, in January, I had, when COVID first reared its head on the daily meeting, I had asked civil servants to start work in terms of actually looking at what the COVID impacts potentially could be, and how that could potentially impact education and what we needed to be doing beforehand.
Yes, because the inquiry has seen that document, and it's pages of practical scenarios as to the sorts of consequences that might follow, including really practical things like social workers not being able to get inside houses to see children.
Yes.
Did you actually look at that? Did you look at that document in order to contemplate all of the different practicalities and the sorts of factual situations that would likely arise?
Yeah.
once the pandemic became more serious, never mind school closures, Sir Gavin?
I know that I had already tasked a team being led by Nick Gibb, who was one of my most senior ministers in the department, to start work on it. I know at the time I was looking at lots of information, lots of documents that were continuously sort of coming through.
And none of that made you think, we need a plan here? I mean, and again, I'm stressing, never mind school closures, Sir Gavin. I'm talking about the potential impact of a pandemic on all school children and in relation to social care as well, which was your responsibility.
Yeah, and that's why we had started much of the work in terms of legislation, in terms of actually looking about how we deal with some of these issues. Some of these issues, some of the challenges that we faced and the solutions that we sought for them. Some of them were the right solutions. Some of them people weren't so keen on them, but we were already trying to make sure many of those problems were being addressed. Sorry.
I'm going to ask you about another document that emanated from this early period of time. INQ 000542415, please. Thank you. The inquiry understands that this document emanates from around the 7th of February, Sir Gavin, and it sets out, it's a document we can see from the title, Plausible Worst Case Scenarios for the Education System. And it sets out information that was known. I don't need to take you through all of this about transmissibility and impact. And if we could just scroll through this document, please, to page 5. Children's social care, that's a blank. Thank you. And if we could go on, please, to page 7. We can see there that consideration was being given to school closures, correct?
That's correct.
And it sets out, we can see from the first paragraph underneath, I'm grateful, that school closures can be effective in controlling influenza. And then setting out that there was uncertainty and it would depend on the disease type. Yes?
Yes.
And if we could go over the page, please. Thank you. It says, if we look at the first bullet, school closures early in the outbreak can be effective at slowing the spread. Benefit needs to be weighed against the cost. And then it sets out costs. And then at the very end, it also sets out some information about alternatives to school closure.
Yes.
So, for example, I think that's really setting out that rotas, for example, or internal movement restrictions could also be effective.
Yeah.
So that would tend to suggest, wouldn't it, Sir Gavin, that your department was well aware and understood that school closures could be an eventuality on the 7th of February 2020.
But there are many eventualities that could have gone forward, and we see through SAGE and many sort of documents through there that there are many times where, you know, it sort of references the fact that children should be sort of staying in school, and when you're seeking a steer as a department as to what to do, because, you know, the Department for Education wasn't a department with a knowledge base of dealing with the pandemic as to, you know, is the main thrust, is the main approach of what we should be doing about the right one still. That was the steer we were getting, that was the case. That was my experience as a a politician, but also I think that was also the experience of civil servants who were also working in the department at the time. And so Jonathan, who was my permanent secretary, that was the exact same sort of steer that he was getting, because obviously as things are moving and things are changing and the information and the data around you are changing, you constantly look to sort of have that sort of guidance. Now that was the, as I say, that was the continuous steer that we had, and that was why, the pandemic plan that we had and we had developed and we had been working on in terms of to be implemented, which actually, of course, did involve school closures, but it was believed that they would be shorter-term school closures in differing areas, was still the right place to be. But I readily accept, as we, what the route that should have been taken was not the route that was taken. I regret that, and I wish we had very much done it differently. But we were, at the time, sort of acting in what we believed was the best interest and under the best guidance.
Who was giving this steer, Sir Gavin, to you that you shouldn't be planning for school closures?
Well, so it was whether it was through Number 10, whether I believe that Jonathan was taking the lead, and he had many discussions with attended SAGE meetings himself, and he was in contact with people within DHSC, and it wasn't being flagged to us that this was the case. And indeed, just days beforehand, the work that we've been asked to generate in relation to this, and on COVID, at the very start in January, it wasn't very centralised. You had sort of DHSC and Matt sort of pushing it and starting to lead it and highlight it and flag it up. But then it started to get increasingly centralised as to who was commissioning the work and in terms of where departments would go. I readily accept that the mistakes that were sort of made here. I remember sat in a COBRA meeting discussing as to, there's sort of like discussions about whether Cheltenham Festival should sort of go ahead, which now seems utterly insane when we know what we know now. But at the time, even those sort of days before where everything changed so much and so dramatically, there was still debates about, racing festivals. And it's difficult as we sit with the knowledge and have the ability to look at all the information there. But whether it was the failure of both politicians and civil servants to truly grasp the magnitude of it, maybe that was the case. But that was part of that failure, and we would constantly look to take the steers, and we would try and act in the best possible way on the guidance and instructions that we were being asked to do in order to ready the system from the direction of the centre.
I'm just going to stick at the moment with the objective scientific evidence that was being provided. We've looked at the early acknowledgement, it would appear, on behalf of the department that schools might close. If we go, and we're still at a very early stage here, if we could go please to INQ 000-75447, please. So again, and it may be, Sir Gavin, that we can start skipping through some of this, but again, early consideration by SPIMO of mass school closures. So not individual school closures, mass school closures. We get that from the top, don't we? And again, if we look at the paragraph 4, because of the higher reproduction number, if school closures have an impact, it would be more likely that it would reduce incidence at the peak rather than to reduce the cumulative number of people infected. Paragraph 5. If there is a value in school closures, it may be greatest around the peak. If the peak is to be chosen as a trigger to close schools, it's likely that this point could be identified in real time. I mean, et cetera, et cetera. So, Gavin, this is not, this isn't. This isn't pie in the sky. Is it that this is serious scientists contemplating the point at which school closures might actually be needed? Correct.
And this is why we were seeking advice as to when to go forward with this. But we are being asked by number 10 to focus and generate documents about keeping schools open, not closing schools. That is the emphasis, and that is what had been the focus. And we were generating those the documents and the policy documents on the, I think it's 15th of March, as close to the change in decision at that point. But the significant shift in terms of there was a clear pandemic plan that was in place that we Cabinet Office number 10 knew exactly what every department's pandemic plans were as part of the sort of structure of government and their reach across government. To have a very different pandemic plan is not something that you can then just do completely solo as a department without Cabinet Office and number 10 being aware that that is what you're going to do. And, it seems difficult to imagine, but, even because people often believe that as a Secretary of State, you maybe have an awful lot of power. But invariably, you are a member, you have collective responsibility. And to do something that had become such an important top priority and make a unilateral decision to develop a whole set of new pandemic policy without the authorisation of number 10, I just don't think that would have been allowed.
So, Kevin, in the course of that very long answer, I think when this was put to you, you said when school closures would happen. Can I take it from that answer that it wasn't a question at this point in time of if school closures would happen, it was a question of when school closures would happen per the advice that was being provided?
On the 10th of February. Sorry.
Yes, was it a question of when school closures would happen?
It is very much if, and indeed, I don't think it was even a, if I think back to the 10th of February, I don't believe that most people felt that school closures was something that was much of a possibility at all to happen.
Not much. Okay, we'll hold that in mind. Not much of a possibility. Can we go then to the next bit of scientific advice? INQ 000 106 109. It's 3 days later on the 13th of February. And can we just look, please, first of all, at page 1, paragraph 5. Paragraph 5, SAGE and wider government should continue to work on the assumption that China will be unable to contain the epidemic. It was by this stage, wasn't it, well clear, Sir Gavin, that this pandemic was now out of control, yes?
I would sort of, yes, it was obviously getting much more widely spread.
And again, if we drop down to school closures, any decision to close schools must consider what objective is being sought. Yes, and then repeating the advice that they could delay the first wave of an epidemic. Yes.
Yes.
We see that at 11. And we'll start to see this and would require closure lasting weeks. Yes?
Yes.
So again, maybe we make a mental note of that 13th of February. You're being warned that they could last for weeks, correct?
I note that.
And again, can we take it that this didn't prompt on your part, and I'm not talking about, as you described it a moment ago, a whole new set of pandemic policy, but this didn't prompt you to think on the 13th of February, we really need to start thinking about what this could mean for children in this country if this comes to pass?
What the clear steer on all of this was that the policy was to keep the schools open, the policy was at the time to keep the economy open. If you look at the broader sweep of where government policy was on the 13th of February, it was not in a position where it was looking at closing schools. Indeed, the government policy at the time wasn't really looking at closing anything. I don't believe probably at the 13th of February. It sort of evolved very, very quickly as the month went on. But, you know, we, in terms of as a department, the advice I was getting from officials, the advice that and steer that I was hearing from, whether it was in cabinet or anything else, was to keep things open, not about closing things. If we had had permission and we'd had the, if the steer had been to develop policy for closing all schools, and obviously we had an understanding that some schools would have been closing, that would obviously been the main effort of everything that went on. But it goes back to earlier, is that what would have been the perfect, or not the perfect, but the better scenario is to have multiple scenario plans for a pandemic as against just one pandemic plan. And the pandemic plan that we had, we continue to believe and to be of the view, because this is what we were this was what we had to have there, was the right one, which it didn't prove to be.
So I think, is that answer suggesting you needed permission to think
No,
from
it isn't.
Downing Street about
No.
the possible ramifications of school closures for children?
It means that you have need for permission to sort of basically act. And as I sort of touched on earlier in my evidence, as you'll probably recall, is invariably the moment in terms of development of any substantive and much wider policy needs the multiple input of many other people, most of who will sit outside of the department because of the nature of the department and the sector is dependent on the expertise that those who usually sit outside of the department. So by the nature of doing it, you are in a position of you're making quite a statement that this is being moved onto the agenda in a much more significant way.
Can we go to INQ 000546701, please? These were the COBRA readiness questions that were sent to your department. The deadline was amended so that the answer could be provided by the 14th of February. And we can see, Sir Gavin, can't we, what are your key decision points, milestones, working backwards from the peak of a pandemic? And it's set out very clearly, isn't it? Key decision at peak of pandemic would focus closure of educational institutions on a more widespread national scale, providing CMO, PHE, DHSC advice supported such a decision. So there was no doubt, was there, within your department that was the key issue that you faced, never mind all of the other eventualities that SAGE might be advising government on. That was the key issue in mid-February. Yes?
It was one of the key issues, yes.
Can we just look at what you said about that, please, in your statement?
Of course.
I think it's at paragraph 410. Thank you. You've said there, I note that the inquiry refers to a DFE response to a Cabinet Office commission in their questioning, where DFE states a key decision at peak of pandemic would focus closure of educational institutions on a more widespread national scale, as we've just read. And if we go down a few lines, you say, I've not seen this commission response before, therefore I can only assume the official who responded was using the worst case scenario document to inform their response. So I think you seem to be sort of disavowing what was said in that.
Well, I hadn't seen it, so I wasn't...
What does it mean? I can only assume the official who responded was using the worst case scenario document to inform their response. Well,
obviously, the worst case scenario would be that schools would not be open. But I hadn't seen on the 14th of February, I hadn't seen the document and wasn't aware of it or its circulation in the Department for Education.
And you set out there at the end, the position across the whole of government in February was largely monitoring the situation, and there was no suggestion that DFE should prepare a plan or policy for mass school closures. It was very much a case of the whole of government waiting for Number 10 and Cabinet Office to give a lead and clear direction. Is that really right? Is that what was going on in the Department for Education?
Because what we were doing is we were working furiously on what had been the pandemic plan, which is what was signed off and what was agreed and what was there. The steer as to how to respond. And we saw quite a bit in terms of, I think, sort of the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, sort of admitted that the, I can't sort of quite remember sort of exactly what he'd sort of said, but he sort of noted that, acknowledge that sort of the scientific evidence available was not appropriately prioritised by government at the time, and as a department, you know, that isn't involved in the sort of the health aspects or the epidemiological aspects of the pandemic. You are waiting for a clear steer from those who are coordinating the response and dealing with that as to what actions need to be done. That doesn't. I didn't mean to.
You're the Secretary of State for Education. You're being advised that schools might close. Are you really suggesting that you have to wait for number 10 to give you a steer before you can start thinking about what the implications of that might be?
But we were thinking about these things, and with the benefit of hindsight, we made the error of sticking with the plan, the pandemic plan that had been there and had been set there. We were probably overly focused on the mission to keep schools open, because that was both the political steer that we had and the policy steers that we were getting. But we were trying to do everything within that to actually sort of take the steps that were going to be potentially required to deal with, you know, an evolving and different situation. But, you know, we constantly, the work as in making sure that we could do our very best to deal with the evolving pandemic was going on. But I do accept that it wasn't being done in the best way, because it didn't end up being totally focused on the eventuality that ended up transpiring.
I thought, Sir Gavin, and we'll come to this, that the whole tenor of your evidence is that you didn't start planning for school closures until about the 16th of March, because that's the first time that Downing Street asked you to provide a plan.
Well, we'd already started, we'd obviously started making plans for individual school closures and how school closures would happen. That could be on sort of towns and on a regional basis. The concept of the shutdown of a whole school system, and, you know, the single document to deal with that, absolutely right in terms of that. But, you know, we continued to be focused in trying to actually look at different interventions that would help to deal with the pandemic and help to deliver education sort of through that. But I don't think it was just my evidence, but it was also my Permanent Secretary's evidence that, you know, the steer that we had had and the focus that we had been given was to make sure that schools would stay open, and we look at every way of making sure that those schools did stay open.
I think we'll come to the plan to keep schools open, because I think it's important that we understand what that plan was. But again, and I'm going to take this very quickly, you will have seen in your papers, if we could just go to this please, INQ 00007 5404. Again, this is the 19th of February. I think we can go straight to paragraph 14, please. Which is on page 3. Yes, so again, school duration of closure 6 weeks or longer. Paragraph 15 sets out that the effect of shorter duration much less clear. Paragraph 21, please.
Sorry, whose plan is this?
Sorry, I'm going too fast. This is more advice from SPIMO of the 19th of February, so it's advice. Paragraph 21, the question of selective school closures with specific year groups requires further consideration and discussion with the department. Yes? So they're early, again, indications that there might be scope for looking at bringing in, for example, rotas at an earlier stage, correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Yep. And then paragraphs 24, 25, giving access to relevant data. But again, I think from everything you've said, Sir Gavin, that didn't prompt the planning about school closures, nor indeed early thinking about whether or not they could be negated potentially by looking at other forms of intervention.
When when I was asking Jonathan to have who was in regular discourse with when I was asking my permanent secretary, who was having regular discourse with them, this was not being then fed to me as in the sense of this is the action that was wanted or that was required. And when we were sort of, as we say, approaching the Easter period, and we were saying, is there going to be a different approach? Because obviously you're seeing a whole set of, COVID evolving and developing in terms of, what is happening on the ground, moving faster than people had been talking about. So peaks had been talked about in June and other times. We were being told that this isn't something that would be happening at this stage. So when you rightly say in my evidence said, there was that sort of sea change moment, that had been the case because we did keep asking for questions as to, what additional needs to do we need to change the plan? Do we need to look at doing things differently? Because you're seeing events going around. But that's equally why we'd started to, start to try and get our heads maybe around the fact that there is a different type of plan and eventuality that has to happen. But I readily accept, as I've mentioned before, as I feel had been the case across government, that the depth of the challenge that we're facing hadn't been properly grasped, and which, I obviously very much wish we had approached that differently.
I'm just going to stay with the advice that was being provided. I'm going to skip some of the advice, but we're still in February 2020. If we go, please, to INQ 000 087 503. And this is the 25th of February. This is a SAGE meeting. If we could go to page 2, please. And paragraph 10. SAGE discussed a paper modelling for non-pharmaceutical interventions, university and school closures, home isolation, quarantine and social distancing. Again, 11, all measures require implementation for a significant duration in order to be effective. Reference to evidence about social distancing and school closures implemented in Hong Kong, Wuhan and Singapore, and the effect they had on the reproduction number. And then reduced spread in the UK through a combination of these measures was assessed to be realistic. Thank you. So when you saw this advice, again, was there any realisation on your part that, again, this could have profound implications for children should it come to pass?
The whole government policy at the time was about maintaining both the economy and schools to be open. And I do not believe that the significant weight was attached to maybe the scientific advice that should have been, that would have then informed and changed the approach that policymakers, both civil servants and politicians, would have had in relation to dealing with this.
So you accept that there's no issue with the scientific advice that was being given. The issue is how that advice was taken by government ministers like you. I
don't think it's probably my place to sort of, as not a scientist, to sort of judge the quality of scientific advice. And there's an immense amount of scientific advice, a lot of it which was excellent, some of it which wasn't always as strong. But I think everyone, in that February period, wasn't putting. I think this was what we saw repeatedly in Module 2, that the weight wasn't put on to that sort of emerging scientific evidence that did clearly prove to be right, and didn't put enough weight onto it. And the whole focus and emphasis of government wasn't probably sharp enough in terms of dealing with that. And that was the case in my department, of which I'm sorry for, because I readily accept that, I was Secretary of State, and it was my responsibility, and I would, understand that, with the benefit of knowing what we know now, I would have certainly wished to do things in a very, very different manner.
Sir, forgive me. The reason why I'm focusing on this, and the reason why it might be thought important, is that this is advice from early in February, which is really specific to your department and really specific to children.
Yeah.
So it stands out in the advice that was being provided for that reason, and because the consequences of that advice could hardly be more serious.
Yeah. So one of the mistakes I think we've made within the department, and we didn't actually, our scientific advice was very much through what I would describe as a spectrum, probably almost as analysis and traditionally the DFE hadn't carried any form of expertise, or really tapped into any form of expertise of people with understanding of pandemics, because it was outside of, it was just not something that was really on the radar of what we should sort of do. I believe that, and this is, the fault of both politicians, myself, civil servants, is, the interpretation of this advice and the priority of this advice wasn't given enough emphasis and brought forward probably as clearly enough to ourselves. And, that's something that we should have done.
Did you ever speak to Sir Chris Whitty or Sir Patrick Vallance yourself in February in order to say to them, can we discuss the potentiality or the potential for school closures?
I didn't have a discussion with them on that. So I didn't have a discussion with them on that. My permanent secretary was in regular contact with them, and it was done on a sort of official to an official basis. Obviously discussed with lots of political people as to where the emphasis and the focus was sort of going to be, and the direction of travel, where that was sort of going to be in terms of the government response. But my permanent secretary was the one who largely led in terms of the discussion between officials on the issue of the scientific advice that was coming through.
So, your officials were attending SAGE, weren't they? I mean, there's no issue about that, is there?
No, none at all.
You had access to the specialist advice?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Does it come to this, and if we can cut through it? Sir Gavin, by the time we get to February, there is no plan in your department, is there? There's no physical plan. There's no document, is there, that demonstrates this pandemic we saw. China doesn't have control. China's lost control of this pandemic. Things are getting incredibly serious. This pandemic could have really severe consequences for children. Here's our worst case scenario planning. Here's a plan to deal with all of those things, or even some of those things that might eventuate.
So we had our influenza pandemic plan, which we had established. We're working out. We're putting up a resource in order to be able to deal with that as that unfolded. We're putting the effort in terms of putting forward, making sure we had the appropriate legislation. And we had the flexibilities that we believed that we felt and understood that we needed to deal with that. Yes, we had a pandemic plan, but we didn't have the pandemic plan that was required.
Can I just, because I don't want to take a bad point. Sir Gavin, are you talking about the emergency response plan that's in your papers?
Yes. But actually it was also more the planning that we'd done in terms of it was actually more in terms of the planning that we had done in terms of how the school system would cope, how classes. We had identified the key issue was going to be workforce shortages. So it was how do we continue to deliver education with workforce shortages as against anything else. So then it was trying to look at how do you make sure children continue to have continuity of education when maybe you've lost 20% of your workforce capacity due to COVID. So that's where all the planning had been, and it was maybe and obviously with the benefit of how the pandemic developed, it was looking at how we delivered that teaching still within school settings with that reduced workforce, and that's where the effort, the time, and the work had gone into and continued to go into.
I'm going to move forward, if I may,
of course.
Sir Gavin, in time. But I think, as we know, things changed from about the 15th of March onwards. And I think we can pick this up at INQ 000286012, please. And this was the document that had been commissioned by the Cabinet Office, correct?
Yes, it is.
And I think, is this right? This was the first time that the headline implications of universal school closures had been set out to the Cabinet Office?
Yes, it was.
All right, I don't think we need to spend time on this, but obviously the most glaring and most serious one is probably the first,
Yes.
that 9 million children wouldn't be guaranteed to receive an education, correct?
That's correct.
And indeed, I shouldn't, if we go to the bottom of this document, please, third bullet up, that there were 400,000 children who were in need,
Yes.
and that school was the better place for those children
That's correct.
to keep them safe. Agreed?
I agree.
So what you've explained in your witness statement, and I think, again, we can pick this up from INQ 00075397. Thank you. I think that this is the commission that was sent for the Department for Education, yes?
Yes,
Of the 15th of March. The first thing,
Yes.
develop a package of measures to make it easier for schools to stay open, correct? So despite whatever planning had been going on before this point, to keep schools open, this is what you were being asked to do on the 16th of March, correct?
Yes, correct.
And we won't go through all of this, but effectively asking all of the steps that might need to be taken, and about vulnerable children as well. You can see
Yes.
that at the bottom, correct? Was this the first time that any such paper had been commissioned?
From number 10.
Had you commissioned a paper along these lines that set out everything that would be needed to keep schools open?
We'd been working continuously on how we keep schools open, so it had been a continuous piece of work. It was where the focus was.
Was there a plan? Do we go back to the emergency response plan for that?
No, because what we were doing is it was actually much wider than that, because we're trying to look at how you gave schools the flexibility and the resilience to be able to stay open with, as I say, one of the key challenges, as we saw, was, a much more significantly reduced workforce.
Shall we go to the document that was provided in response to this? That's at INQ 00075398, please. Page 1. To be clear, this is a 2-page, 2-line document, isn't it? Yes?
Yes.
And it says, this note responds to the ask for a package of measures to support schools in staying open for as long as possible. We have set out our thoughts, which seek to respond to what we have heard over recent days from school and trust leaders. Correct?
Yes.
And if we drop down a couple of paragraphs, I think it's acknowledged that schools might be forced to close. 4th paragraph, the context for this note is that schools are starting to find it challenging to stay open. And then this is the 6 strands of the programme. Is this the programme that you had been working on? Is this what you're talking about?
No, because this is a brief document that's sent across government at a request. What we'd been doing was looking at, as I say, how you create the flexibility within the workforce in order for schools to be able to continue to deliver education. You were looking at ways that they would able to teach more children in one class, lifting restrictions, creating flexibility, which I think, if I recall correctly, it sort of mentions within the document. It was lifting a number of the burdens that and some of the requirements that schools to do, such as in primary schools, that might be in sort of areas such as testing. It was looking at every single possible way that it meant that a school was going to be able to continue to function, if not normally, but as best as possible. But, you know, that is where we had been looking at how we can sort of strip things down in order for things to continue to function.
So just looking at this very briefly on these 6 strands. First strand, a call to arms for schools as community leaders. Second, reduce the burden of accountability.
Yes.
3, I think, cease inspections. 4, that's a reference to the draft emergency bill, isn't it? Deregulating
it is,
around
yes.
numbers of teachers, meeting additional costs, working with local government, reassure parents, remote working. Yes?
Yes, correct.
So none of that is concerned with any of the sort of steps that you might take in relation to infection control. None of this is about rota systems, any of that sort of any of the practical steps that might need to be taken to keep schools open, correct?
Well, we weren't looking at rota systems at the time, and I think rotas, I mean, everyone will have a different view on sort of a rota system, but we weren't sort of looking at rota systems. We were very much looking at, in terms of, I think there'd been early advice in terms of dealing with COVID, but it was what you'd probably describe as very sort of similar to what the overall government advice was about, minimising contact, but sort of cleaning hands, wiping down surfaces and everything else like that. But I believe that had already been issued to schools at an earlier date.
On the 16th of March. Can we look then at what happened to change?
Of course.
That changed your direction, and go to INQ 000075399. And we can see, if we go please to page 3 of this. Thank you. And I think this is the point, isn't it, at which things change, Sir Gavin? An email is sent at 8:45 on the 17th of March 2020 that there had been a meeting. This is sent to your permanent secretary, referring to the meeting of that evening. Not sending a formal commission, but sending an email. Yes?
Yes.
I think, is this, and I just want to identify this, is this the point at which things changed and this is the commission to close schools? Is that correct? So just to be clear about it, and let's look at that, because I think we're coming to the adjournment. We should look at that paper before we do. Cool. That's at INQ 000107248, please. This is the paper, isn't it, on closing schools?
Yes.
And I think if we could go to page 2, please. We can see in the second paragraph, and I'll come to this, about that schools should close to most children after the Easter break. We can see the recommendations just a little further down that page, that the Prime Minister recommendation that the Prime Minister announces on Wednesday the 18th of March that the government will bring forward plans on schools. And then at the bottom, the summary of the proposed way forward. Thank you. And if we go to the bottom of page 3, please. So, vulnerable children. And thank you. If we go to page 5. Key exams and remote learning. And page 6, please. I think, Sir Gavin, there's an annex attached to this, but I think that's the plan, so to speak, at central government in England for closing schools.
Well, it was
on the 17th of March.
They wanted to have a submission for that day. That's correct.
My lady, I wonder if that would be an appropriate.
Yes, of course. Sir Gavin, as you'd appreciate, we take regular breaks to stenographer. I think you might appreciate it's going to be quite a long day for you.
I think so.
So I shall return at 25 to.
Okay.
All right. Stubborn.
Thank you, my lady. Sir Gavin, before the adjournment, we had been looking at the paper that had been commissioned overnight on the 17th of March, and which you agreed on the 18th of March. Can I just pick up your statement then at paragraph 4.42, and that's page 25, please? And if paragraph 4.42 could be enlarged. And you set out there, and this is the reference to the meeting that we saw the email about. At this meeting, in what was a discombobulating sea change over a 24-hour period, Number 10 officials commissioned the Department for Education to produce a paper on closing schools and other options for the Prime Minister. Correct? And
Yes,
it had
correct.
been drafted overnight. Yes?
Yes, correct.
And it was drafted overnight because, as we've rehearsed, no such plan existed before this point in time, correct?
Well, no, because we'd been asked to do a paper at 8:45 on an evening, and you have to produce the paper on the basis of what they asked for the paper for.
And similarly, if we go to paragraph 4.35 of your statement, that you hadn't had any discussions with stakeholders about the possibility of school closures prior to that point, because at that point in time you did not understand closures to be under consideration.
Yes, and we, just on the Friday beforehand, I had attended the Association of School, College and Lecturers annual conference in Birmingham, where teachers from across the country had all gathered together, had teachers from largely secondary schools and colleges, and the key message, which has been cleared by Downing Street in terms of the speech to the union, was that schools and colleges were to stay open. That was the absolute clear theme, the message that they were wanting us to get out onto the media. That wording had been agreed before I went, because usually when a Secretary of State makes a speech, especially on something that was going to touch on the biggest issue of the time, you generally have to sort of get that cleared and approved, which that was sort of done. We then, obviously into the next week, was when things started to shift much more dramatically.
Yes. And just looking at paragraph 4.53 of your statement, where you set out that no impact assessments had been made prior to the announcement on the 18th of March, because the position backed by Sage Advice continued to be that schools should remain open I knew that closing schools would present a number of risks to children, which is why I continued to push for schools to be open for as long as possible and to ensure the most vulnerable can continue to attend school.
That's correct.
So the bottom line is this, isn't it, Sir Gavin, that by the 18th of March, and the day when school closures were announced, there had been no planning, there was no plan to implement the closure of schools in England.
We had a good base of knowledge that we were going to be able to sort of draw on, but what we couldn't have done before that point was to really start consulting with stakeholders where the value would have been doubly added, because actually one of the key criticisms, which is a very valid criticism, is the ability for people to have the time to stand things up. But the challenge.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
No.
But you haven't answered my question.
Okay.
And it's one of the most important questions, possibly, that Module 8 will ask.
Okay.
When it came to the 18th of March and the Prime Minister announced that schools would close to almost all children in England, there was no plan, there was no written plan, there was no document, there was nothing concrete in existence that planned for the closure of schools, was there?
There's a whole set of body of work that's already been started, whether it's discussions and work with Ofqual in terms of the potential impact of what happens if we're not able to proceed with exams. There was people within the department who had started to do that thinking. What we couldn't do, and you can't ignore where the media interest was. The moment we had gone out and sat down with the trade unions or the different organisations and said, this is an option that we are looking at doing, at closing them. We don't think it will happen, but we think it may happen. There's a possibility. It actually would have become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the moment you have that conversation, every single newspaper would have been reporting that schools are closed because discussions have been opened with unions and everyone else like that. And this is one of the biggest challenges, because actually to get schools in the best place to deal with these things, you either needed to have a really good set of plans that had been there for a long time, long before we'd started talking about a pandemic, and there's this scenario, or this scenario, or this scenario, and they can get it. But the ability to have a whole set of confidential conversations with stakeholders that this is going to be a real prospect in terms of how they are going to have to sort of do things and implemented things. It would have ended up making the decision for schools to be closed before any decision for schools to be closed was the case. And still the steer all the way through was that schools were to stay open. But, had work started in terms of, what does it actually look like if we can't have exams? What are some of these sort of issues? But in one collective body of work and talking with the unions and talking with other people about it, no, that hadn't happened.
No, Sir Gavin, let's get really down to basics here. Okay. This is about almost every child in England not being able to go to school and requiring education in their homes. That, for a start, requires thought about massive infrastructure, doesn't it? How do we possibly even start to do that? Correct?
And I think you raise a really important question here, an incredibly important question, and I thank you so much for raising it, because you're spot on. To have got this right, you're absolutely correct. That needed a whole set of decisions, not actually just in February, but it needed actually decisions probably to be taken in January. So if we look at remote education, for example, which I know we'll move on to at a later stage, I imagine, but, what you would have needed to do, you would have needed authorisations of Treasury in order to be able to start spending the type of money that would be required in order to be able to deliver that continuity of education and that contingency. But, you know, the idea that in February I had turned round to Treasury and asked for an additional £100 million to purchase laptops on the possibility, which wasn't government policy, wasn't what the Prime Minister was saying, wasn't what the Chancellor was saying, that I could purchase, I don't know, a few 100,000 laptops. That just wouldn't have been available. And I wish that could have been available, and I wish it could have been done, but I think it would be misleading, and I think, we all know that it just wouldn't have happened in that timescale.
Vulnerable children, thinking about what children might need to be protected. That was done on the 18th of March, wasn't it?
The details of it was formalised on the 18th of March, but the thinking had been done long before that. And one of the great successes, one of the things I feel very proud of, we were the first country in the world to say that vulnerable children were going to be children that were going to continue to have access to school. Now, you hadn't seen that happen in Italy or France or Spain or Ireland or anywhere else. It was England, it was here in the United Kingdom that we did it first. And that was driven out of the Department for Education because we knew how important it was for vulnerable children to have that link. And we also knew that, even though we didn't expect to see the mass closure of schools, or maybe there was an optimism bias where we just desperately hoped we wouldn't see a mass closure of schools, but we knew that schools would close. But even when we were planning it to make sure that vulnerable children would be a part of something that was protected. So yes, it was formalised in a document that was sent to the Prime Minister on the 18th of March. But the sense and understanding of what we were wanting to do in priorities, because actually the work that we had been doing prior was still sometimes valid and had a crossover into the changed circumstances that we then found ourselves in.
I'm just going to move on, Sir Gavin, to the provision of remote education. I don't think I need to rehearse this, but in June of 2020, the Department for Education estimated, didn't it, that there were 1.3 million children who didn't have access to an appropriate device. Is that a figure you're familiar with?
Yes, it was. It was a figure that we provided.
12,500 schools didn't have access to a cloud-based learning platform, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And the inquiry has heard evidence, and I won't rehearse it, from the Sutton Trust, for example, that as of March 2020, they were gathering data about the differential access children had to education in their homes. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And if I can just please bring up your statement at page 72, paragraph 9.23. This is the table of devices that were delivered to children. It's a cumulative table, isn't it?
It is.
So these aren't separate tranches. And I think for our purposes, what might be helpful to know is, and to have confirmed, that as at the 30th of June 2020, of that 1.3 million children who didn't have access to an appropriate device, that just over 202,000 devices had been delivered, correct?
That's correct.
The rest after the school holiday. And I think we can see that devices were not the figure that needed to be gotten to wasn't reached, in fact, until March 2021 or thereabouts. That's slightly shy of 1.3 million, isn't it?
That's correct.
And do you accept that for the duration of the first set of school closures, that had a serious impact on the ability of children to receive an education in their homes?
Yes, and that's why we had already undertaken additional provisions to try and we had looked at everything from voucher schemes and many different other schemes in order to be able to look at ways of making sure children could access education, even if it wasn't the best way. We're asking schools to use any devices they had to make sure that they were out with children as against out at schools. Part of the reason that vulnerable children were allowed to keep coming into school was because we were conscious that those who were most vulnerable were probably the ones who were going to struggle most to have a device. So the idea of at least if they're able to go into school, that they might not be able to have a device, but they're still able to get education. But if I can just take you back, the global the ability to procure 1.3 million laptops is sadly quite sort of challenging. And this is where we see one of the consistent weaknesses in this country is that there's a total unwillingness because of economics to carry contingency. And we have very little contingency in this country. In fact, the only place in terms of departments that carry contingency is defence, because they have to by nature. Defence is a contingency. But until you have a different mentality, the first mention of the pandemic in mid-July, let's assume Treasury had a totally different approach than Treasury have ever had in my experience of 15 years of being a Member of Parliament. And I go to them and say, I've heard that there's a pandemic in Wuhan. I need to procure 1.3 million laptops. One, they would have said no, but let's say they say yes. Then the ability to get 1.3 million laptops largely produced in the People's Republic of China. We do not have any significant domestic manufacture of mass market laptops or devices.
So, Gavin, I'm going to interrupt you. You've made the point that laptops were difficult to get hold of.
Eve, you wouldn't have able to, just the supply chain of shipping them from China to the UK and having them manufacture. At the time, we were the largest purchaser of laptops anywhere in the world. And the reason you can see, and you can see through the numbers, I kept purchasing them, was because I knew how important it was. And do you know what was really frustrating? What was so frustrating? Back in April, I was not asking for extra money, but I was wanting to use £168 million of my own budget that I'd got as an underspend to buy more laptops, but I wasn't allowed to do that. So instead of spending £168 million, I ended up only being able to spend £85 million of the money that I had there. And this is one of the constraints, because you often, as Secretary of State, you are desperately trying to do absolutely the right thing, but you are constrained from doing it, and you don't always have the freedoms that you wish to do. And if we'd been able to do that, that would have had a material impact in terms of those numbers coming through. But it's not always down to the choices that we have as an individual Secretary of State. I'm sorry for going on.
If I just interrupt, I think when you began your answer, I think you said, had you gone to the Treasury in mid-July? Did you mean mid-January?
Mid-January. Thank you ever so much, my lady. I was definitely, thank you for correcting me.
I'm going to move on, Sir Gavin, to a different issue, which might be headed lack of transparency, and whether that was an issue. Can I ask, please, for Sir John Cole's witness statement to be brought up, please? It's at it's at INQ 000 651 602, please, and it's page 12. And this is his paragraph 37. So, Gavin, I won't read all of it out. And he has given oral evidence to this effect. He was appointed to be a member of the recovery group convened by the Department for Education and sought to give advice. And the inquiry has seen contemporaneous evidence of this, asked for access to modelling and scientific advice. And he's explained that it wasn't provided, and he sets it out there.
Okay.
He explains in this paragraph that he was a strong advocate for a rota model, but never had access to what advice was being given about that. I don't know if you saw his evidence or if you're familiar with the evidence that he provided to the inquiry about that.
Yes, I heard some of it.
And I think in your witness statement, you have also dealt with a matter that arose from a notebook that was kept by Sir Patrick Vallance, in which it was suggested that the Department for Education wasn't seeking advice from SAGE. Yes, before you go on, I'm just going to say something about that. My lady, obviously Sir Patrick Vallance hasn't been called as a witness in this module and therefore can't explain the notes himself. So I think it's important to just say what he has said about them before I go on.
And also he did say it was a brain dump, I can't remember, but
Yes.
It was at the end of a long day and he wasn't necessarily confirming the accuracy of every entry.
Precisely. He has set this out, and I think it's right and fair to say it. These notes were not carefully considered, objective reflections written in the cold light of day of the type that I have set out in this witness statement. They were hastily written, subjective, reflective of my mood at the time of writing, and were often partially informed thoughts, which I put down on paper simply as a means of clearing my head and enabling me to focus on the challenges of the next day. They were placed in a drawer at my home, and that's where they would have remained had the inquiry not requested their provision and decided to disclose them. I ask that if they're to be read by others, that they should be read with that context in mind and that my privacy should be respected. If we go to your witness statement, please, Sir Gavin, at paragraph 8.4. That's page 63. I'm grateful. Diary entries were put to you, and if I just read what you said, these relate. I note the inquiry has asked me for my view on 2 diary entries from Sir Patrick Vallance, dated the 23rd of June and the 25th of June. These relate to the publication of SAGE advice. I can see that the entries state that the Department for Education didn't want to ask SAGE about schools, as the minutes would be published. I don't have any recollection of this. DFE used SAGE advice throughout the decision-making around schools reopening, whereas number 10 in the Cabinet Office put a higher and lower emphasis on SAGE advice and its importance at different points throughout the pandemic. So, Sir Gavin, I've put what Sir John Coles said about his inability to have access to scientific advice that you were receiving.
Yes.
And obviously you were asked to comment on those entries that were made by Sir Patrick Vallance. So can I ask you the question outright? Was there a reticence on the part of your department to seek advice for fear that it would be published? And that I assume, or I think the suggestion would be put, that the department would have to deal with people who would use it as ammunition for not reopening schools.
So no, and obviously all SAGE advice is published regularly. I wasn't obviously privy to the conversation between Sir Patrick and Jonathan at the time. My recollection of Lord Valance and Sir Chris Whitty and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer and so many others and the sort of Chief Nurse is actually we try to bring them in to conversations with stakeholders. This may shock you, but actually if you've got a politician telling trade unions about their interpretation of scientific advice, they don't put quite as much weight on it as someone who actually is qualified in that area. So we almost try to use them more to have those discussions with people. And I think, and I may recollect this incorrectly, and please correct me if I do, but I think Sir John referenced the fact that he was on one of the groups. I think that we'd even got some of the, when we had our own epidemiological sort of scientific lead in the department, was liaising with these people, but we're also trying to bring in that expertise from the Chief Scientific Officer, the Chief Medical Officer, the Deputy Chief, Jenny Harris, where we worked incredibly closely with all the way through. And we try to, it sounds a horrible thing to say to use the phrase, use them, but we did actually try and get them to have FaceTime with people to talk about these issues because they could better explain it in a way that, I couldn't, who didn't have the depth of understanding.
Sir John Coles was appointed to be a member of a recovery group to provide advice to your department.
Yes.
And we've heard evidence from him was really keen on finding ways to reopen schools and wanted to find pragmatic ways to do so. I'm summarising,
yes,
but that's what the tenor of his evidence was.
And maybe
why was there an issue about? Why was he's given evidence to the inquiry, and you've seen in his statement?
Could you bring up his statement again? Would you be so kind? Thank you so much. Sorry, I'd only just briefly read it, so it'd be very kind if that could just be brought back up for a previous slide that you had.
That is INQ 000651602, page 12, paragraph 37.
Sorry, thank you. So it did include analysis of options. I mean, I'm not sure as to why that hadn't sort of been shared. I don't think that there's certainly no sense of where they're wanting to be conspiracy at all. I mean, as has sort of been mentioned also in the sort of statement, a private briefing from SAGE for teaching unions was made available, but I don't know why that wasn't made for the Recovery Advisory Group. But I would have thought, and I could be wrong on this, so I would have thought that the Recovery Advisory Group would have certainly had exposure to either the Chief Medical Officer or the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, or some of those who were advising very much at the sort of top of government. I can't imagine they would have been excluded from that, but I don't know for certain.
I'm going to move on. I mean, it appears from what he's saying that he didn't, when he saw SAGE papers published in May, that's when he realised that the Rota model had been raised. So I think that suggests he hadn't.
Yeah. I think, though, obviously SAGE produced a lot of comments and a lot of minutes and a lot of suggestions. But then often what that was done was then that was taken up and developed through either individual departments. Public Health England would obviously be one of those sort of key delivery for what they were sort of doing. And then, so SAGE, as we know, is not just 2-3 scientists. It's a very large group of people contributing their expertise. And I would have thought that the Recovery Advisory Group would have had one of the sort of senior government medical people probably talk to it at some point, but I could be incorrect on that.
There was secrecy, wasn't there, around the decision at the point in time when government had decided to reopen schools and was thinking about the contingency measures that might be required from September 2020 onwards. You agree with that? Do you want me to?
I would say that we worked very closely in terms of actually talking with a broad range of people on things. Everything was ultimately going to be public documents. How do you mean by secrecy?
Well, let's have a look.
Of course.
Can we go, please, to INQ 000 088 256, please, on page 1. This is a COVID strategy group of the 6th of August 2020, just so that you can orientate yourself, and this is your paper. And I think at paragraph 39 on the next page, it explains that there was a national fallback plan. Yes?
Yes.
And I won't read all of that out. It goes into the next page. It sets out the operational challenges of the fallback model. It was kept a secret, wasn't it, from schools, that there was a fallback plan?
I would say that we were mainly keeping the focus on the core aim of opening schools because at the time, if it looked as if we were planning for another scenario, then the other scenario could end up becoming the default scenario. We were, I think, probably learnt a number of the lessons of where we had failed in February and March to make sure that there were two properly and very fully developed scenarios so we weren't in a position where we didn't have a sort of set of policies as well developed.
Can we go, please, to INQ 000 088 257, please? This is the COVID strategy meeting of the 6th of August 2020, correct?
Correct.
And if we go over the page, if we go to page 6, and in discussion, if we see at the very bottom, the following points were made. Schools should not be told of a fallback plan, as it would allow them to have an excuse not to open in September. Yes?
Correct.
Hadn't one of the main lessons from March 2020 been that not letting schools know that they might have to close to most pupils put them in the terrible position of having to pivot to providing education to children in their homes without being able to plan for it?
So we knew that we had to have the development of a contingency plan if September return wasn't going to be the case. But we had the strong belief that if it was widely advertised that there was an alternative proposal in order for schools not to return, it would become significantly more difficult to get the full return of all schools in September. And I wish that wasn't the case, but that was the situation that we faced.
Is that really the state of discourse about children's education in this country, that a government can't be open, that it is on the one hand opening schools, but on the other having to have a contingency for the possibility they might close?
The difficulty is people will say they want absolute certainty, and then at other times they will say that they want to see every single option. We believed that to get schools back, we had to give an absolute certainty and determination that schools were going to go back, and we needed children to go back. This was, and I will accept fault on this, during that first lockdown, I saw, and we saw not just with our own eyes, with our own children, with our friends' children, through the evidence that was accumulated, that children had actually suffered as a result of not being at school. And we also saw that children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, not like, lucky children like mine, who, many others who, you can move a world for in order to try and look after, but ones that had no one to look after them, they were going to be most disadvantaged. And the difficulty we were going to have is if we didn't have the clarity and the determination that schools were going to go back, there was, and it's a disappointing thing to say, but there would have been some schools and there would have been some actors that would have tried to use that as a reason not to allow schools to go back. Because while you would like to think that every single person that was involved in this wanted to see children back in school, that frankly just wasn't the case. And yes, of course, in a perfect world, everyone would be totally united with the exact same aim of getting children back into school, the safest places in the classroom. But that wasn't the case and wasn't what we're having to deal with. I didn't believe at every stage, whether it's advice to scientific advice and people who had knowledge, I tried to make them available to unions, other sector bodies. That was really important because that hopefully gave them the confidence. But the political reality is, if there's a number of people who thought that if there was a cord that they could pull that means that they could stop schools returning into September, I think sadly, and it's very disappointing to say this, they'd have grabbed the cord and they'd have tried to yank it. But, we hadn't got things right in February and March, so I was very clear that we had to have a contingency plan in place. Of course, it would have, of course, some schools would have liked it, but what most schools wanted was a clarity and a certainty of what they had to do. And I felt, and maybe this was my fault, I thought it was really important to give them a clarity and a certainty that I wanted those schools back, I wanted those children back in, and I wanted those vulnerable children back in, because we saw all the way through that first lockdown, the number of vulnerable children that were actually going into school so incredibly low. And actually the only way to get them all, more of those children back in, the only way to do that was getting all children back into school, because they're the ones that, yes, of course we're worrying about all of them, but those are the ones who were at the most in danger. So it was so important. And, you might think it was wrong. I think actually it was right because we got all the schools back and we got children back into schools. So whether it was, you might think it's not the proper thing to do. Actually, I think it was the proper thing to do because it got what I needed to happen, and that was children back into schools. And if you have an issue with that, well, you've got an issue with that, haven't you?
In terms of who it was that was applying the pressure, or who you thought would get in the way of schools reopening, are you talking about individual school leaders, or who was this? Who was it that could?
If I look across the school system, we have an amazing school system. You've got amazing teachers, you've got amazing head teachers who work so incredibly hard. But you did have some actors. You took the National Education Union, for example. They quite simply opposed teaching in school, and they opposed teaching remotely as well. I mean, I'm not sure what they expected teachers to do, but they certainly didn't want them to teach during the pandemic. And so you have a very large militant organisation that was willing to throw resources in and wanted, would occasionally play lip service to wanting schools open, but more often would not. Okay. So these were some of the challenges that we sort of faced.
So it was union pressure. Is that the?
That was very much one of them. And can I just say, many of the unions were absolutely fantastic and had an amazingly constructive approach in terms of trying to work through some of the really, really difficult problems that we faced.
I'm going to move on, just whilst we're on Sir John Coles. The inquiry has also heard evidence from him about exams.
Yes. And
about his concerns that accrued over the spring of 2020 about the assessment. So the replacement for exams. And I know that you're familiar with the background to this, Sir Gavin. You set it out in your statement. You made a direction, didn't you, to Ofqual to develop and implement an alternative system of grades, yes?
Yes, it is, right.
And one of the directions that you gave them was to put in place arrangements for standardising results across schools as well, yes? And we know from what he has said, and we've seen the letter, that Sir John Coles went to you because he was so concerned about the potential unfairness of this, correct?
That's correct.
And we've seen his letter. I mean, I can take you to the letter if it would help.
I've seen it, but I've read it.
Do you agree he sets out in that letter why, as a matter of principle, the model that had been arrived at was unfair?
I can see his arguments, yes, and that's why I asked to have a meeting with him.
Yes, and he explained before the inquiry why the model was unfair, and he was asked in his evidence, was that broadly what he had explained to you, and I think he agreed that it was. So can I ask you then, at that meeting, did you understand why he was saying it was unfair?
I very much understood the concerns of where he was, and when we looking at Sir John's evidence, we didn't have the way you went through the whole model and how Sir John so articulately and clearly sort of explained it. That wasn't quite the discussion that we had. It was slightly more generalised, as I recall it. But what really stood out to me, it was, I think it was Sir John. Because if we go back to the March period when we had first talked about the standardisation of grades or the moderation, I think the phrase was used at the time. What everyone was clear on, there needed to be a moderation mechanism that sat over what was then in the first year referred to as centre assessed grades. This was universal. It was an approach that had been taken not just in terms of England but also Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. And this was driven because there was a real fear that children from most disadvantaged backgrounds were going to be most disadvantaged by centre-assessed grades, or effectively teachers making those decisions. So it was felt to be the right thing. Sir John's voice was the first voice I had heard that said that there's something sort of wrong on this. And when I sat down with him, and as you know, Sir John is a very thoughtful, experienced individual, both experienced in both teaching, in the school system, but also in government as well. And that's why I immediately asked him to sort of follow this up with my policy advisor, with Nick Gibb as well, who was my Minister for School Standards, to actually sort of further that discussion, to try and arm them to put some of the challenge to Ofqual. Nick had been meeting Ofqual, I think, on a sort of a weekly basis all the way through this point, and I had also sort of met them. And they'd got their own expert panel in terms of a sort of a moderation element. And everything we'd been told was that this was absolutely the right system. So it was really worrying when you had this sort of key voice come up and sort of flag that.
Yes, so you took it presumably really seriously that he had these principled concerns about the model that had been arrived at.
That's great. That's why I think in a space of a very short period of time, I think only a few days or maybe a week from receiving the letter, I had organised a meeting with him.
He told the inquiry that you said at the meeting with him, well, I think you might be right, John, but I think it's too late now to do anything about it.
Well, I certainly have no recollection of saying we always understood that there were going to be some students who wouldn't get the grades that they would deserve, and that's why an appeal system, and this is why mechanisms to actually get that corrected were needed to be put in place. Because quite simply, there is no perfect form of assessment. Even exams are not a perfect form of assessment, but they're probably the best form of assessment that we have. But without over the previous 11 years, there's been a significant shift in terms of how assessment had done, moving away. So when I did my GCSEs many years ago, some of my GCSEs were 100% coursework. Most of them would have a 25% coursework component. Virtually all GCSEs and A-levels have virtually a 0% coursework. So there was no sort of structure or body of work that you could base, any other form of assessment on. So we knew that there was going to be weaknesses within the system. That's why I insisted on having an exam programme that people could take in the autumn, which again wouldn't be perfect, but we were aware that it wasn't going to be a perfect system. I don't recall, looking at the minutes of the meeting, I don't recall saying what was attributed to me, and nor do I actually, because at the time we were still having Ofqual be quite clear that the system was robust and proper and absolutely the best system.
I'm just going to pin down whether or not you agree with what his fundamental objections were to the model and that you understood them as set out in his letter. You did understand, didn't you? Or let me ask you, did you understand what he was saying, that for all large subject entry cohorts, they will discard the centre assessment grades in their entirety and rely solely on their statistical model combined with the centre's rank order?
Yes, I understood.
And that's really the nub of what he thought was so unfair about this. Do you agree? And he set out in the letter to you, the problem with this rationale is that their statistical model will not be statistically valid for large cohorts either. He explains it clearly in the letter. It's easy to build a model which calculates an expected grade distribution for a school, but there's too much variability in outcomes for this to be accurate in all but a minority of cases. Correct?
I note that was one of the points, yes.
And that's not complicated, is it? He's just making the point that you might be able to say this school normally gets 10 grade 5s, but that isn't fair on the individual who sit in the exam that year and who might exceed that. I mean, I think that's the basic point, isn't it?
Yes.
And that this was a model that was favouring consistency of outcome and controlling inflation rather than recognising fairness to the individual.
Yes, I think the model was quite clearly wrong. We felt at the time, and when we consistently went to Ofqual for reassurances about the issue of fairness, was that it was the correct model to be pursuing.
There was nothing wrong with the model as such. The model was doing what it said on the tin, wasn't it?
I don't think there was there wasn't a realisation in terms of the individual impact in terms of students. And I think this was something that we saw in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, as well as in England. I think that there was too much of a collective groupthink, and this wasn't just in terms of just in England, but I think it was actually in terms of the devolved nations as well, that this was, the best route. And I don't think that people hadn't understood and truly comprehended the unfairness that it would sort of kick out, and at the scale that it would do. And there'd been a belief that by robust appeals systems and other measures, that where there are unfairnesses, that would be something that could be dealt with.
You must understand that telling children that they would be assessed on a model that I think you seem to accept was problematic, but it's all okay, you can appeal, is deeply unfair to children.
The whole premise of what we came up with was, as you look back on it, was just not the right approach. And I'm afraid to say, even with Sir John's changes to the system, it would have still ended up being the wrong approach. And the reason it ended up being the wrong approach is the school system is, it is incredibly diverse and it is incredibly autonomous. But there is a couple of things that people will always hold true, is that the person that knows the child will best understand the child. And any system, and even with various modifications put into it, would have actually been the wrong system, because anything that would have varied what the class teacher was saying a child was worth compared to what, Ofqual or whoever had designed it, or the Scottish Qualifications Authority, or the Northern Irish, or the Welsh, it would have always seemed to be unjust. And we should have, though, everyone at the time in March, and indeed when my getting more and more concerned about the system and was trying to look at different ways to put, because we don't get the detailed data until the day before. We get a briefing at sort of 6 o'clock the day before. I mean, very much in the way you would do in peacetime, not in sort of wartime. But even before that, and seeing what had happened in Scotland, the real worry and the real concern of sort of changing that, trying to put sort of mitigations in place. The reality is, whoever, when you put in that moderating system over and above teacher assessed grades, it was always going to create a sense of conflict and a sense of unfairness. And that's why in the following year, we took a completely different approach. But we should have understood that position. Sir John's concerns that were raised should have made us change the system. But equally, at the time, was listening all my professional advice in terms of qualifications and assessments. That's within Ofqual. That has effectively been hived out of a department, I think, probably sort of 10 years beforehand, into a sort of non-ministerial government department. And it wasn't totally my decision, because they are the awarding authority. So you had to bring them along, and they were very clear that their system was right. And I think if I had turned round to them, and I probably should have done, but if I had turned round to them and say, we're scrapping the system, we're going straight to centre assessed grades, I think the chief regulator and the whole Ofqual board would have resigned at that point, and they wouldn't have accepted it, or they would have tried to resist that implementation. Because even when we try to do changes to what I would say make it fairer and try and deal with the rising concerns, it was incredibly difficult to get them to agree to any of those changes. But in reality, on the 18th of March, we should have probably understood, everyone should have understood where people's faith would be. It's not in any form of moderated system. It would always be with the teacher that knew the child.
Why were they so concerned about grade inflation, given it was an emergency and a crisis, and one was hoped would have been over by the following year? We know now that it wasn't, but that would have been the optimism bias. Why were they so concerned about grade inflation, and did you challenge it?
Well, I think it was always... I think it was set up as an organisation to be obsessed with grade inflation. Education thinking, actually, for 15 years has been concerns about grade inflation. So I think that Ofqual, I mean, within its structure, and its sort of founding principles is to make sure, standards and maintenance of standards. And I think it's just that sort of ability to shift. And as politicians, we're equally sort of and civil servants, because we've all been saying the same thing for so long. Hard to believe, but we do actually believe what we say. It's we thought this is the right thing, and so even though that scope had been given to show more leniency, I still think it's just systematically the way the organisation thought. It was almost institutionalised within it. And I do think in terms of how we, like, some institutions are designed perfectly for peacetime, but when we're in a different phase, actually the structures, how they operate and how they work with the rest of government, you can't operate like that. And I would certainly say, if God forbid any of my successors were in the same position that I found myself in, is you've got to sort of bring all of this into the department, and it's got to be owned, it's got to be directed, it's got to be, if it's we literally spent probably about 72 hours in desperate negotiations, waiting for like 6 hours for board meetings to conclude to see if they would moderate or change things. You can't do that in a pandemic, and I think that we've got to have a different set of thinking for when we're in a very different set of circumstances that was, wasn't quite there.
Thank you.
So, Gavin, I think you've accepted in response to what my lady asked you that moderation, it wasn't just off-call driving moderation, to be clear. It was you also.
It was the Labour Party. It was.
I'm asking questions about your responsibility.
Of course, but the reason I was driving it was because if I spoke to the General Secretary of every one of the teachers' unions, they would say the same, moderation was required. Every one of the head teachers' unions, they would say moderation was required. Every one of the schools' bodies, they would say moderation was required.
And but Sir John Coles, sorry to cut across you, Sir John Coles also agreed with you that moderation was required. It wasn't the issue of moderation, it was just how it was done, correct?
No, I don't think moderation in the way that we were taking, what you had to do was make sure the evident teachers could as much. So for second year, we had the opportunity for teachers to properly evidence base how that they were coming forward with their grades, and that worked very well. But I think any form of moderation that we'd put over on the centre assessed grades would not have worked. And I think that, if you're not able to, and I don't know what the examination and assessment system for GCSEs, A-levels will be in 10, 20, 30 years' time, when, if there is another pandemic, but if they haven't got that sort of body of cumulative evidence, which is something that we, now ask all schools to sort of do, you are going to you're going to have the same difficulties as we did. And any moderation system, and a moderation system fundamentally means someone other than a person that knows the child changing a grade from maybe a C to a D or a B to a C is going to be met with the same problems as this one, even though this system was imperfect. But every system will end up being seen as imperfect as well.
All right, I'm going to move on, if I may.
Of course.
So, Gavin, just to deal with an issue that you raise in your statement that I think it would help to have clarity with.
Of course.
And I mean, this really relates generally to the period of time late summer leading into the reopening of schools. And it's the criticism you appear to make of Mr. Johnson at paragraph 8.11 of your statement. And I'm going back slightly in time to ask you about the reopening of schools.
Oh, yes, of course.
And you set out here that on the 9th of May, you were informed that the Prime Minister had made the unilateral decision that he would announce the following day that there would be a phased reopening of schools. Correct?
Yes.
And I think if we read everything, we see a few lines down. I also agreed with the concept of getting all primary school children back into school before the summer holidays, but I knew that this wasn't possible to deliver. And then following this on down, if we pick it up, this meant that unless the Prime Minister decided to go against his advice and change these rules, this was a promise that he wouldn't be able to keep.
Yes.
And then you set out, I believe that prior to making the announcement, the Prime Minister had been advised about this from his own officials and DFE officials. The Prime Minister understood that I didn't agree with his announcement. This was because it was destined to fail, as he would not commit to removing the social distancing restrictions. So, Gavin, can I just understand what it is that you're getting at and what you're saying that he was doing that you disagreed with at this stage?
Okay, so prior to the announcement, we had agreed the return of a number of years back into schools, and this was to cover across, secondary schools and primary schools, touching on transition years and everything else like that. That had all been agreed, and we'd been in the position of talking with stakeholders across the board, letting them know that this was going to be the case in order to be able to get them to be prepared for that. Then when the announcement happened, it was all of those years that we had sort of believed we had agreed with number 10 were all coming back, and we had been having that dialogue and discussing with others about them coming back. But then he'd also said he wanted all primary school children coming back as well, which, can I just say, I'm totally in support of. But the difficulty was that we weren't going to be able to get all primary school children back under how the current social distancing rules were. Because if you can put yourself into a primary school, an average primary school will be, even the largest classes, at maximum, you can get, under the social distancing rules, which education settings are as bound by as any other government institution or commercial institution, organisation are bound by, could only get a maximum of 15. So unless, obviously the transition years and the years that are coming back. So what was having to happen is those, instead of all those 30 children being in one classroom, 15 were in one, 15 were in another. Obviously, if you bring all primary school children back, you don't have a spare amount of double the classrooms or double the teachers necessarily to be able to sort of teach them all in. So what we needed to do, if we were going to be able to deliver on that ambition, and I think the Prime Minister wanted to set a big ambition, but the only way we could deliver on that is if he said, well, actually social distancing rules means that you can have 30 children in each of those classrooms, so relax it for everyone, which to me it was absolutely clear the government wasn't going to relax social distancing rules at that level at that time, or they were going to have a carve out or an exemption for education settings, which means that we could have done that. Otherwise, there's just no physical way that you could do it without asking every school to basically break the law.
You've obviously raised this in your witness statement as a distinct criticism of him, and I'm really asking on behalf of the inquiry to identify what the criticism is. Is it that he cut across the work that you were doing to make an announcement that was completely unreal? I mean, was it damaging for you? Was it damaging for schools?
Well, I think it was damaging for schools, and I think it was damaging for children and parents, because actually what parents heard was the Prime Minister saying all your kids are going to be able to go back to primary school before summer, which is what actually every parent, myself included, really wanted to sort of see happen. But we all knew that we weren't going to be able to deliver on it because there was no chance or seemingly no chance or will to change the social distancing rules either for the whole country to make that happen or create a carve-out to do so. So I felt that it was giving people a false sense of hope and belief that something that was going to happen. And inevitably, 2-3 weeks later, you then have to tell everyone, oh, we can't deliver in this. And I think it becomes quite clawing and undermining of the system because, would I like to do it? Yes, but I can't ask every head teacher in the country to break the law in order to deliver that. And I think Number 10 knew that was the case. And I always recall my private secretary, principal private secretary at the time, Warwick Sharp, phoning me up just literally before it's going to happen and say, he's going to announce this. And it was like, you know, why is this off script? And also, you know, you did try your hardest to build a bond of trust between stakeholders, and I'd been saying to them one thing, and then to them to hear something completely different to what you've been telling them was, you know, makes them think that you're either being, you know, sort of not fully open with them, which certainly hadn't been the case.
Can I ask you then whether it goes to this thematic issue that has been raised by other witnesses as to whether or not decisions that went fundamentally to the education of children were in reality being made by Downing Street rather than the Department for Education?
I think that's a very thoughtful question because I think that if we look at education, if we look at sport, if we look at virtually every aspect of life, the decisions that were being made that were impacting those areas, whether it's children in terms of education, whether it is business, whether it was, you know, so many different sections of society, they were, you know, often being made away from the department, and you know, obviously the priorities of the Department for Health were the ones that possibly overrode all of their interests. Understandably, with the challenges of the pandemic, you know, there's obviously going to be a much greater emphasis on that, and we may come on to this later in terms of January reopening and everything else like that, but what you were seeing is a number of times where I thought the interests of children were better served by doing one thing. You still found yourself in a position where you were having to do something quite different because that was in the interests of a different part of government, and that was a decision that's effectively between Cabinet Office, Number 10 and Department for Health were making those decisions.
I'm not going to bring it up. There's a different extract from the Valence notebooks, and obviously all of the caveats previously stated apply, whereby the Prime Minister was suggesting plans for schools feeble. Was that being communicated to you from the centre, that it wasn't thought that the Department for Education was doing a sufficiently good job?
Boris, Mr. Johnson would sometimes veer between sort of different positions. I know that in the August of 2020, he was really concerned about our plans to get schools back, especially in terms of home-to-school transport. And I think that might have been what it was in reference with, because we had a meeting. He was really, really concerned about this. I think this must have been early August in which it had occurred. And especially in terms of some of, getting children from home to school, also children travelling across London and such like. The Prime Minister was actually incredibly helpful in terms of actually making available Lord Hendy in order to be able to try and help us and support us to get a much better plan. But I know that was a particular criticism, because I don't think he felt that that was well thought through enough and well developed enough. And we worked with Lord Hendy, Sir Grant Shapps, who was Transport Secretary at the time, to get a much better plan, because it wasn't in a good enough place. And I have no doubt that my department, there were many times that there was sort of, we did get things wrong, and you know, I am sure that will have caused him frustrations, as it caused all of ourselves frustrations when we didn't get things right.
Thank you. My lady, I think that brings us to the short adjournment.
Certainly, I shall return at 1:45. All right.